Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the mental health and personality characteristics that may be at work in the Betty Broderick murders. Broderick murdered her ex-husband and his wife in 1989. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. So here I'll look at the background of Betty Broderick, the timeline of the crimes. I'll move to the mental health and personality factors, and then look at her sentence and talk about my opinion on whether the sentence was just or not given the circumstances. So starting with the background, Betty Broderick was born on November 7, 1947 in East Chester, New York, which is in the southern part of Westchester County. She was the third of 6 children. She graduated from high school in 1965. That same year, she would meet 21-year-old Dan Broderick at a party in South Bend, Indiana. She had traveled there to watch a Notre Dame football game. She was 17 at that time. The relationship was on and off for a while as Betty finished her degree in childhood education. Betty would later say that Dan pursued her, suggesting he was obsessive-compulsive and stalked her, which is ironic considering her behavior in the future. The couple would marry in 1969 in a lavish ceremony. According to Betty, the nature of the relationship shifted after this. When they were dating, she said she had her own vehicle, her own money, and freedom. After they were married, Dan took charge of everything. She felt as though she had to do what he said. Betty had 5 children between 1970 and 1979. One of her children died just a few days after he was born in 1973. Not long after this, Betty attempted to end her own life. As Betty stayed home and watched the children, Dan Broderick earned a medical degree and a law degree. After completing a 2-year clerkship, Dan took a job in San Diego, California, and the family moved to La Jolla, California. The job became the center of their existence. Betty reported that all of their friends were attorneys or wives and children of attorneys. Eventually, the family moved to the Coral Reef neighborhood of San Diego. In 1978, Dan left his job and started his own practice. He earned a considerable amount of money. The family had a comfortable lifestyle. In 1982, 21-year-old Linda Kolkina started working as a receptionist in the same building where Dan had his office. He began having an affair with her, and shortly after that, he hired her to work as his legal assistant. Within about a year, Betty started to have suspicions that Dan was having an affair. She confronted him on multiple occasions, but he denied any infidelity. Betty demanded that Dan fire Linda, but he wouldn't do it. November 7, 1983, Betty turns 36, and Dan misses her party without providing a reason. She attempted to end her life for a second time. On Dan's 39th birthday, Betty visited his office, but discovered that Dan and Linda had already left for the day. After she returned home, she burned her husband's clothing as her children watched. In September 1984, the family moved out of that house in Coral Reef to a 5-bedroom rental in La Jolla Shores. Evidently, the Coral Reef home needed some repairs. This living arrangement continued until 1985 when Dan moved back to the Coral Reef home, saying that he just needed some space. Betty dropped off the children to Dan one by one, saying things like, "You'll see what it's like raising a family by yourself." Eventually, Dan obtained a court order designed to prevent Betty from entering the house, but she kept coming over anyway. There are a number of instances where Betty became aggressive. She threw a wine bottle through a window. She left angry voice messages on the answering machine. She put a hole in one of the walls. She spray painted the curtains and walls and smeared pie on Dan's bed, ever so subtly expressing some underlying anger. Many of these things that she did while the children watched, and she would say things like, "The court can't keep me out of my own house." Dan filed for divorce in September 1985. This would begin a brutal divorce process that would last until 1989. Evidently, Dan leveraged his knowledge of the law and his contacts in the legal community to deprive Betty access to shared assets. Betty claimed that she could not find adequate legal representation. Dan created his own system of financial penalties for Betty. He would charge her $100 for every expletive that she used, $250 for every time she walked onto the property, $500 if she entered the house, and $1,000 if she took one of the children without permission. On top of these fines, Betty was also put in jail a few times for violating the court order. Dan would sell the house in Coral Reef and move to the Balboa Park neighborhood. Betty drove her car through the front door of that house. During this incident, Dan tried to remove her from the car, but she reached for a butcher knife she had under the seat. After this, we see Betty spends 3 days in a mental health facility. When the divorce was finalized in January 1989, Betty lost custody of the children and received a settlement of $28,000 cash as well as $16,000 a month in alimony. Evidently, this was much lower than she had expected. Sometime around March 1989, Betty purchases a 5-shot Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver. Dan, not soured on the idea of marriage, marries Linda on April 22, 1989, on the front lawn of their Balboa Park home. The couple hired security guards for the ceremony because they were worried about Betty showing up. The threats and the less than polite communication continued after the marriage. Now moving to the timeline of the crimes. November 4, 1989, Betty receives a letter from Dan threatening to take her back to court and preventing her from seeing her sons. Apparently this was because she kept leaving voice messages full of expletives. The next day, November 5, Betty Broderick, eager to reserve the coveted prison venue for her 42nd birthday party, which was just 2 days away, drives to Dan's house and makes entry at about 5:30 a.m. using a key she had stolen from her daughter Lee. She made her way to the master bedroom to find 44-year-old Dan and 28-year-old Linda sleeping. She fired all 5 shots from the revolver. Linda was struck in the head and the chest. She died instantly. Dan was struck in the chest once, and evidently he survived for a few minutes before succumbing to his injuries. 2 of the shots missed. At some point after the attack, Betty also removed the phone in an effort to prevent Dan from getting help. Betty called her daughter Lee and, among other things, communicated that Dan's last words were, "Okay, you shot me. I'm dead." Technically, of course, "I'm dying" would have been more appropriate, but under the circumstances, it's understandable. After this, she turned herself into the police. Betty would later say that she just wanted to go there and make them listen and end her own life, forgetting that being shot at detracts from the application of quality listening skills. Now moving to the trial. The facts of the actual murders were not really in dispute during the first or the second trial. Betty had shot both Dan and Linda. The trial was really about whether she committed second-degree murder or manslaughter. Essentially, the same narrative is presented by both the prosecution and the defense in both trials. The prosecution argued that the murders were premeditated. They portrayed Betty's escalating violent behavior, the fact that she stole the key to the house, and the fact that she entered the house and killed both victims, as evidence that the crime was planned. According to the state, Betty was a cold-hearted killer. The defense argued that Betty was the victim in this case. Dan had committed to her by marrying her and raising a family together. Then he broke that commitment by having an affair. During the divorce, he took custody of the children. He told Betty that she was crazy, what we would now refer to as gaslighting, and then he limited her access to financial resources. He lied repeatedly over the course of years, therefore caused emotional damage that led to Betty killing him and Linda. They argued that it did not rise to the level of second-degree murder. In the 1990 trial, the jury could not decide between second-degree murder and manslaughter. In the 1991 trial, the jury convicted Betty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She received 2 sentences of 15 years to life and another 2 years for the illegal use of a firearm. She was denied parole a few times, evidently because she did not show any remorse. She is eligible again in 2032. She will be 84 years old at that time. She has referred to herself as a political prisoner because she was denied parole. Now moving to the mental health and personality factors. During her trial, a mental health expert named Dr. Park Dietz testified that Betty had both histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders. I really thought about this idea of both histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders as far as Betty's behavior. Let's look at histrionic first. How does this align with her behavior? This disorder has 8 symptoms. One is uncomfortable when not the center of attention. That could be. Inappropriately sexually seductive. I don't really see that here. Rapidly shifting and shallow emotions. Maybe. Using physical appearance to draw attention to oneself. We do see that she bought a $40,000 fur coat while she was getting divorced, but that alone wouldn't necessarily align with this criterion. Excessively impressionistic speech, I don't really see that. Self-dramatizing and theatrical, that's a possibility. Being suggestible, I don't really see this one. And evaluates relationships as more intimate than they are. I don't know about this one, but we do see where she thought that everybody would side with her automatically after she committed these murders, but that's not really the same thing. It does show a distortion, though, in how other people are seeing her. So someone could make an argument for maybe 4 of these symptoms, but I don't necessarily think this is a good fit with her behavior. Now looking at narcissistic personality disorder, here we see 9 symptoms: grandiosity, fantasies of success and power, believing oneself to be special or unique, requiring excessive admiration, having a sense of entitlement, being manipulative, lacking empathy, often being envious, and having an arrogant attitude. I don't see strong support for most of these. One could make an argument about a lack of empathy, being manipulative, and the sense of entitlement, however. In reading through this case, I was surprised that borderline personality disorder really wasn't brought up very often. If we look at this disorder, we see an argument could be made for 5 of the symptoms: frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, suicidal behavior, affective instability, and inappropriate or intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. As far as the other symptoms, it doesn't seem like there's good alignment. It seems reasonable to believe that perhaps borderline wasn't brought up because that would have been a more sympathetic disorder than something like histrionic or narcissistic that has a more negative connotation, even though all of these disorders, along with antisocial, make up cluster B personality pathology. The real question with these personality traits would be, were they present before the affair? Because one of the arguments that can be made here is that this was situational. She was reacting to the extreme stress of dealing with somebody who is narcissistic. So was her behavior a long-standing pattern, or was it due to narcissism exposure? This is an interesting case as far as the conceptualization because it's so polarizing. There are some people who look at this case and say, this is first-degree murder. She walked into the room. She shot 2 people to death. That's the end of the story. Others look at the behavior of both Dan and Linda as completely unacceptable. They ran off. They had this affair. Dan repeatedly lied about it while trying to tell Betty that she was the problem. And then he uses his education that he received with the support of Betty to defeat her in a court of law. Figuratively speaking, Betty handed Dan a gun that he would later use to shoot her. It seems reasonable to believe that both Betty and Dan had cluster B personality features. Perhaps Dan was more of a grandiose narcissist. He had a sense of entitlement. He dominated her. He didn't like her anymore because he found somebody younger and more attractive. He was ready to trade her in and upgrade, indicating a degree of shallowness. In the case of Betty, she simply couldn't cope with this. She couldn't recognize that the relationship was over. She was holding on to something that had died long before. She believed it was her right to have Dan for the rest of her life. She believed she was entitled to a certain lifestyle, to the perfect family, to the mansion. The ideal life was shattered, and her identity was tied to that life. So her identity shared the same fate. This case is so tragic because 2 people died for no reason. Their deaths didn't bring Betty peace. Her lifestyle in prison can't be better than the one she could have had on $16,000 a month. It would appear that she is intransigent and unrepentant. She still believes that she did the right thing. Society should have taken her side, that because she was the victim of an affair, she had the right to kill. It's likely she would have been paroled if she could have just expressed regret. She never truly accepted responsibility. She said that when she took one step into that bedroom that morning in 1989, Linda yelled, "Call the police." And then the gun just went off by itself 5 times. Evidently the gun aimed itself too. So was justice served in this case? What do I think about the verdict and the sentence in this case? Well, I can appreciate that Betty was the victim of narcissism exposure, but there are indications that her behavior was aggressive long before the affair. I think both the conviction and the sentence were fair. Most anyone could appreciate that she had every right to be upset, but she took it way too far. Now, another question kind of related to this is, what was Dan thinking by being unprepared in his home? So Betty just gets the key, comes in and kills them. Based on the behavior that she had manifested over many years, it was clear that she was dangerous. Even just the driving the car into the house incident would be enough to convince somebody that she wasn't playing around. Why didn't Dan have a firearm near his bed, a dog, an alarm system? How is it that he felt safe, especially after he just sent a letter that he knew would provoke Betty? He even indicated in that letter that he knew it would make her angry. Well, the answer to the question may be narcissism. The day he was married, he reportedly said that Betty would never hurt him because he was too valuable to her. He was paying the alimony at the time he was married. This nearly delusional thinking made it easy for Betty to end both his life and Linda's life. So there are my thoughts on Betty Broderick. If you like this content, please subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.